they don't want to have to choose between United States and China. If you listen to the former Singaporean diplomat, Kishore Mobani, he has said again and again, we don't want to be forced to choose between United States and China. What he's really saying is if you keep on pushing us, we're gonna have to choose China. Because Southeast Asia, their economic destiny is already tied to the rise of China.
Hello and welcome to Global Majority for Peace podcast. I'm Ileana Chan. Every week on this podcast, we discuss with special guests from across the world our mission of building a global movement to promote peace and challenge the US-led war drive against Russia, China, and countries in the global south. So please subscribe and share and comment, etc. We try to encourage people to join our Patreon. So we will be putting the first part of this interview on YouTube and the full episode on Patreon. And we also release a podcast audios every Saturday on Spotify, Amazon Music, and Patreon, along with a transcript. So please help us sustain our work by supporting us on Patreon. We are so happy to introduce our great guest today for Global Majority for Peace, Carl Za. Carl is actually the most recommended guest that we've had so far, so we're very pleased to have gotten him. Most of you probably don't need an introduction, but Carl is an American journalist. Do you consider yourself an American journalist? I,
I consider myself a shit poster online. I mean, I just I just share whatever's on my mind, and for some reason, there's a lot of people following me.
Okay, I will continue. Carl is a shit poster online, no, a political commentator and podcast host known for his analysis of Chinese history, politics, and culture. He is the host of the Silk and Steel podcast. Welcome to Global Majority for Peace, Carl.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for coming. So, we like to start with a personal note. You spent your childhood in China and moved to the US as a teenager. Could you share with us how that shaped your current worldview and how did that lead to becoming a political podcaster, commentator?
Oh yeah, it actually has everything to do with it. So I was born in China in 1976, 1 month after Mao died. So I'm the first generation of post-cultural revolution generation that grew up in China. And I spent the entire decade of 80s in China, have a very happy childhood. And my dad was the first post-cultural revolution generation of Chinese students that came to US to study. He came to US in 1985 to get his PhD. So I joined him in 1990. And when I came to US, I was very hungry for news of my homeland. So I would read pages of New York Times, Washington Post, whatever. Just look for anything reporting on China. Back in 90s, there's very few and far in between. But the China they describe in their pages is totally unrecognizable to me. It's like they're describing a bizarre world. It has nothing to do with the place I just left. So at that time, I thought, okay, that's just because the Westerners don't understand China. They just don't get it, like it's a mysterious Orient for them, they just don't understand. I chalked it up for cultural misunderstanding. And, I remember 2000 when I started working, I came across a online publication called The Exile. It started by a bunch of American expats in Moscow, in post-Soviet Russia. And it was started by people like Matt Taibbi before he went mainstream, Mark Ames, John Dolan, etc. So they write about how mainstream media would report on Russia because at that time, Matt Taibbi is one of those journalists who worked for those Western reporting on Russia. He would say, actually, everything is a template. I will literally have the story all written out on my flight to Tashkent in Uzbekistan. Like before I even interview my interviewees, I just need to fill in the blanks of the people who I interview. And when I read that, it was like a light bulb went on. I'm like, wow, okay, so this is basically how they report on China too. I mean, like it's the same template in post-Soviet Russia. They blame everything on Soviet Union, even though in 2000 was already like more than a decade after the collapse of the Soviet Union. They will still blame all the social ills on the Soviets. And so I recognize this is a pattern. This is not reporting. This is propaganda. And I think what radicalized me even more was Iraq war that soon happened afterwards. And up to that point, I would say up to Iraq war, I was politically liberal because my side gig in high school was delivering New York Times. So I had a habit of reading New York Times every day. That shaped my political view from when I was a teenager to like my early 20s. But by the time Iraq war rolled around, I thought, okay, this is crazy. New York Times was actively pushing for war and they're whipping public into a frenzy. They're reporting on this totally bogus story of like Nigeria, yellow cake story, how like WMD, and they're just scaremongering the public to push them into supporting the war. And I thought that was outrageous. And at that point, I kind of finally became fully distrust of the mainstream media. And then the Syrian war happened. That's when I joined Twitter because I already know I don't trust the mainstream media reporting. So I decided to go to more firsthand source. So I follow everybody. I follow like ISIS sympathizers. I follow Syrian government supporters. I follow like Kurdish militia supporters and all the Washington think tankers. So it's fascinating to see how the story was spun. You can see the narrative being built. I realized none of these mainstream media had any reporters on the ground in Syria. They literally just took the words of the so-called moderate opposition, or I call them moderate jihadis, and then report them as facts. And that misled a lot of people in the West. And then right around Trump's first term, this is when like the anti-China propaganda got cranked up to 11. And that's when I felt compelled to speak out because, I just decided to share my own experience growing up in China, having Chinese friends, Chinese family, having traveled extensively in China, what China is really like. It's nothing like the way it's been reported in the page of mainstream media. And somehow I ended up with a large following on X. That's when I started my ship poster career. And so here I am. This is my kind of the Carl Zhao origin story.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Carl. You were actually one of when I first started podcasting in 2021, it was actually from listening to you. And then I was like, oh, I would love to talk to people like Carl. So this is a really full circle moment for me. And I'm like happy to get to do this. Of course, we're now in the middle of May. And we've just had the US and China trade agreement that was announced after 2 days of bargaining in Geneva. Now, a lot of people were quite surprised at the speed at which this agreement was made. Of course, Trump supporters are claiming China caved, but from the outside, it is hard to see what Trump achieved with this for his base. Can you help us unpack what happened and what the significance of this is?
Well, I'm actually surprised too, but after witnessing the Trump supporter reaction, I'm thinking Trump should have caved much earlier. Like it doesn't matter what he do, his supporters will spin this as a win anyway. He has nothing to lose. Basically, China got everything it wanted. China's Commerce Ministry have said going into the talk, they said, okay, we're open to talk, but provided it must be on an equal basis, based on mutual respect and all the unilateral tariffs that was imposed since the Liberation Day must be canceled. And that's exactly what happened. I mean, Trump rolled all the way back to before April 2nd, the so-called Liberation Day. So now we have, China and US basically kept 10% tariff on each other for appearances. And in addition, Trump kept the 20% so-called fentanyl tariff that he imposed before April 2nd, before the Liberation Day announcement. So what's all this 1 month of absolute chaos in supply chain all about? What did Trump accomplish? I mean, in terms of China, they accomplished a lot. It showed the world that United States is not a serious country. But on the other hand, China has come across as a global leader. China is the one that pushed back and got Trump to back down. And on top of that, you also show who really have all the cards because the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, he keep on saying, "Oh, we got all the cards." As a consumer nation, as a nation that runs trade deficit, we have the power. We're in the position of power because Chinese they cannot live without us. They need our money, and it turns out that's not true because China has been prepared for this moment. I would say even from the first Trump term because that's when the sanction on China really started back in 2017, 2018. Back then, it was a rude awakening for China, a lot of business people in China, because they didn't expect that to happen. And then, you have the rest of Huawei CFO Meng Wanzhou, who is a daughter of Huawei's founder. She was detained by Canada on behest of the United States for quote unquote sanction busting on Washington's sanction on Iran. So supposedly Huawei provided the telecom service to Iran. I mean, that's a big shock. That's a big shock moment for China, business community in China. And that's when they realize, Washington is no longer a reliable trading partner. And Biden, when he came to office, he just doubled down on the Trump first term policies. So China, since 2018, they have been trying to decouple and de-risk from the United States. They did that by trying to open new markets, sell to countries outside of global North countries. They particularly expand their trade links with the global South. So today, even before the Liberation Day announcement, so-called Liberation Day announcement, the United States is no longer the largest trading partner of China. United States is number three. Now, United States came number three. The top trading partner with China is ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Countries. Number two is European Union. United States is number three. So when Scott Bessent acting like China cannot live without United States, that's totally false. Because first of all, China has developed its own consumer economy. Today, Chinese middle class has a number of around 400 million. China has a bigger middle class than the entire population of United States combined. And just to give you an idea what that means, China is the world's largest market for cars. They sell 30 million vehicles in China every year, and that's twice the number of United States. The US is only the world's second largest auto market today. This is why when the so-called Liberation Day came around, Xi Jinping did not pick up the call. Instead, he went to travel through Southeast Asia because those are the China's top trading partner now. And one part of that is what they so-called transshipment. So what happened is because of the pressure by US for countries and multinationals to decouple the supply chain from China, many of them have moved operation to Southeast Asia, even in the years prior, particularly to places like Vietnam, Indonesia, etc. One is because the wage has been rising in China. So more labor intensive operations are being pushed out. And two is because the Washington's push for decoupling. But the reason many businesses chose Vietnam is actually because Vietnam's proximity to China, because Vietnam is closest to all the existing Chinese supply chain. So even though some manufacturers, the final assembly is moving to Vietnam, but it's still dependent on Chinese machine parts, Chinese components. So essentially, the Chinese supply chain got expanded, got pushed out to the rest of Southeast Asia. And the Southeast Asian economies are now even more tightly intertwined with Chinese economy. That's what the US policy has brought. And that is why when Xi Jinping traveled to Vietnam and traveled to Malaysia, he got red carpet treatment. And you have People's Liberation Army honor guards marching through the streets of Vietnam, and the women were calling them husbands from the sidelines. I mean, this is Vietnam. This is a country that some people in Washington was hoping to turn into a cornerstone to contain China. And like these countries already made their position very plain. They realize their future lies with China. And on the other hand, while China has been preparing for the last 8 years to decouple and de-risk from the United States, Trump apparently has no plans. I mean, he thinks their tariff is some kind of magical bullet who will fix all the problems. And it's like I like to use analogy. Well, United States we know has been hollowing out its industry for 40 years. The Wall Street has been offsourcing manufacturing to East Asia since 1970s, before China even opened up. And it has reached to the point that tariff would help your manufacturing if you have manufacturing. Right now, US don't have manufacturing anymore. I mean, it gotten so bad where now even Pentagon has given up on producing in United States. I like to say the only thing US produce anymore is weapons and OnlyFans. And apparently that's not even true anymore because Pentagon is now going to South Korea, Japan, and Turkey for help with the naval buildup against China because U.S. only had three shipyards that is capable of producing warship at the moment. And the Pentagon admits China has 200 times the shipbuilding capability than the United States. So right now, Pentagon is even give up on bringing manufacturing back home and going to other countries to build warships. U.S. actually has a law that specifically prohibits to build warships in foreign countries. But Pentagon and Congress are now working to skirt this legislation to have U.S. warship being retrofitted in the shipyard of South Korea because it will be much cheaper to do. So in this kind of environment, tariff is not going to help. Tariff is not going to help because you have to build the entire supply chain from ground up, and that's not a couple month efforts. That's not like 90 days. You can't do that in 90 days. You cannot do that a couple months. You cannot even do it in several years. It's like a decade long process. I mean, China, it took China 40 years to get to where they are. It took 40 years to build up the infrastructure, educate their population, and to finally build a ecosystem where they produce everything. For United States to reproduce that, it's a multi-generation effort. But U.S. politicians they don't they don't plan out that far. I mean, all they care about is like the next election cycle, right? And the same with the Wall Street. They only look at quarterly earning reports. A multi-generation effort, what are you talking about? That's not going to happen. This is why the Trump approach is okay, we'll just raise the tariff so high. We're going to basically cut off our trade with China, so we have to produce in the United States. But what the hell are you going to do in the meantime before you can rebuild your manufacturing base and rebuild your supply chain? You are basically embargoing yourself. I mean, like, if China had imposed a trade embargo like before the Liberation Day announcement, this would be considered an act of war. But Trump's like, no worry, we'll do it to ourselves. Let's just impose an embargo on all Chinese goods coming to the United States. And this is why the market panicked. More than $1 trillion got wiped out from the stock market after the Liberation Day announcement was made. And this is because all the businesses know this is crazy, this is unsustainable. And we had just before the trade talk that was wrapped up, the director of Port of Los Angeles, the largest port in the United States, they said they saw a 35% drop in container traffic coming to the port of Los Angeles. And it was only going to get worse. And, like prices were already rising in the United States. And this hasn't even really hit the US consumer yet because when the US consumer were making their purchases on Amazon, they were still purchasing like the inventory that was built up by Amazon for like pre-tariff announcement because all these businesses has been building out their warehouses in anticipation of the tariff. So they built a large stockpile, and when they build a stockpile, they have to pay more warehousing fees. Guess where the warehousing fee, the additional costs get passed on, it get passed on consumers. That's why the price already start rising. And then That's not the worst. If that trade war had dragged on, by June, July, we would see shortages. We will have empty shelves. I think this is what really pressured the Trump administration to basically buckle and cave because they realize it's going to be really, really bad. If they act right now, at least they can maybe save the back to school sales, maybe. Even with the announcement of the 90-day pause, the damage is already done to the supply chain because even if the Chinese supplier says, okay, let bygone be bygones, let's just go back to business as normal. If they ship the loads of ships today in China, guess what? It takes anywhere from 20 to 30 days to cross the Pacific. And by the time all these ships come to Port of Los Angeles, you're going to have a major traffic jam, right? Because all these ports are designed for smooth flow of goods. They're not designed for this kind of big pulse of goods coming in at one go. So the supply chain is already FUBAR for next month or two. But more importantly, it's a damage to the reputation of United States all around the world. And now after Trump slapped tariff against everybody, people realize, holy crap, like you can't do business with countries like that. And business hate most is uncertainty. And Trump just throw a lot of uncertainty into this equation. So, for example, after the tariff announcement, if there are some people said, okay, well, now I guess we have to build in United States right now to avoid the tariff, and then make a big investment in US. And now suddenly there's a big rollback. All your investment just poof, just gone in the drain. I mean, that's terrible. And also, all the big businesses like Walmart, Amazon, they might be able to eat the temporary disruption. They might eat the loss. But a lot of the small, medium businesses are getting wiped out because their margin is thin to begin with. And they also, a lot of times, do not have like 5 to 7 weeks of inventory because, they were trying to be lean operations.
Even Walmart, has just announced that they will be rising prices because they're claiming that they also have small margins. So, so it's affecting all. And then the other thing I was thinking about as you were speaking, which absolutely supports your points, is recently the Qatar Air Force One plane that Trump is supposed to be getting from Qatar. Apparently, that's because Boeing would take 5 years to make make a plane for him. So again, like you're saying, it's just proof, isn't it, that the manufacturing is just not in the US at the moment. But as you were saying, Xi Jinping went to Southeast Asia during that time. However, I want to ask you about Indonesia since you are based in Bali. So, in November of 2023, US Secretary of Defense Lloyd J. Austin III and Indonesian Defense Minister Prabowo Subianto signed a historic defense cooperation agreement between the US and Indonesia. Now, Indonesia is part of ASEAN, as you have mentioned before, and is in a very, very strategic area in the South China Sea. Can you give us your assessment of how Indonesia is positioned? Is it able to resist US escalations in the region? And is there any significance to Xi Jinping skipping Indonesia in his last Southeast Asian visit?
So Indonesia is actually a very interesting case because in a way, Indonesia is very typical of Southeast Asian countries. And the Southeast Asian countries' motto is to be enemy of none and to be friends to all. They don't want to have to choose between United States and China. If you listen to the former Singaporean diplomat, Kishore Mubani, he has said again and again, we don't want to be forced to choose between United States and China. What he's really saying is if you keep on pushing us, we're gonna have to choose China because Southeast Asia, their economic destiny is already tied to the rise of China. But at the same time, traditionally, Southeast Asian nations also wanted to use their kind of engagement with United States to play like a balancing game where, they will use US to balance China, but vice versa. But they are perfectly happy to do trade with both countries because both are very important markets to Southeast Asia. But ever since Hillary Clinton's pivot to Asia during Obama's term, United States have been pushing really hard for the Southeast Asian countries to choose. And these Southeast Asian countries have done their best to avoid to making that choice. They are trying to like really walking a very tight rope in the playing the balance between US and China. Their economic interest was tied with United States, but some of their security interests is tied with United States, particularly in case of Singapore. And Prabowo, for example, he traditionally have very close tie with United States because as a person from the Indonesian military traditionally had very close tie with United States throughout the Cold War. So this is what Indonesia is trying to do. It's trying to strike that balance between avoiding getting on US bad side, but continue economic engagement with China because right now, China is the largest foreign direct investor into Southeast Asia, Indonesia included. And, I'm in Bali. Right now, I'm talking to you over the 4G network built by Huawei. The electricity that I'm running right now is provided by a power plant that was built by China in north of Bali. And a lot of people in Indonesia, like my babysitter, they're able to afford smartphones. This is because China made smartphones affordable to everyone in the global south. And so in many ways, Indonesia's continued economic rise is tied with with China's economy. The gravitation pull of Chinese economy is such that all of the Southeast Asia right now is being embedded into the Chinese supply chain. On the one hand, Indonesia just joined BRICS, right? They became a full-fledged member of BRICS because they want to have a seat at the table. They see BRICS as increasingly important alternative international forum to the traditionally Western dominated international organizations. Again, they don't want to be forced to choose. Keep in mind, China is not making any of them to choose. It's the United States that telling them you're either with us or against us. In fact, China very much would like them to keep their trade tie with the United States because this is where a lot of Chinese product still find their ways into United States. If you look at the trade figures of Vietnam, for example, their imports from China is way up. Their exports to United States is way up. You can just put two and two together to see what's really going on. So all the components and machineries are being shipped from China to Vietnam, and for the final assembly, so they can get stamp on made in Vietnam stamp and then get exported to United States for a lower tariff bracket. That's what's going on. And this is one of the reasons Trump initially slapped tariff against everybody across the globe because he was trying to stop that, but it's a fool's errand. And so I think Southeast Asian countries will continue this path, will continue to engage China economically, but politically try to stay on US good side. I mean, this is a very difficult balance act, especially when United States keep on pushing and pushing and forcing everybody to choose. This is why Kishore is telling Washington again and again, we don't want to choose, we want to choose. But what he's really saying is, look, if you force us to choose, you may not like who we choose.
I mean, how does this rule, the new US rule against the use of Ascend computer chips made by Huawei, how is this going to affect, like you're saying, all the industries are enmeshed around the world? So how is this going to affect us all?
Well, this actually everything is related because Trump just recently went to the Gulf countries,
Right.
Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, etc., right? Where it's a big spectacle. Well, there's a reason why Trump is going to these countries. Well, he needs some money. Unlike what Scott Besson says, the world needs our money. No, actually, the United States needs money. They needs money from this oil-rich countries because these countries have built a large surplus of US dollars from exporting oil, and Trump wants part of that money, and to particular to finance the $500 billion Stargate project. You know, they keep on talking about this 500 billion Stargate project where they're going to build up data center in United States to power the AI development in US. Well, US don't have that money. They're hoping for the oil sheiks of the Gulf to provide that money. And this is why China present a big threat. You know, when China released DeepSeek, again, that wiped $1 trillion off the US stock market because a lot of the US stock market is in the tech. There's a big AI bubble that's building up in US right now because they're saying, oh, you know, in a few years, AI is going to do everything. They're going to take over all the jobs of the white collar workers. You know, it's going to be super abundance. You don't, nobody have to work anymore. So they're making AI this utopia, but really they're just blowing up. They're selling the AI to the stock market to hype up the AI prices. This is also the reason why there's a big fight between like Sam Altman and Elon Musk. This is all about money. You know, if people follow the money, the whole AI bubble in United States, it's a bubble because currently, what has AI produced? ChatGPT, Grok. I mean, okay, chatbot is useful, but at the end of the day, it's a chatbot. Whereas AI in China is applied very differently. China use AI in their manufacturing because remember, China is a manufacturing superpower, whereas United States is a PowerPoint presentation superpower. That's why we have, you know, we lead in ChatGPT at least for a while until DeepSeek. This is why the emergence of AI threatens United States. It threatens all the tech bros that right now that's part of the Trump administration. You know, Trump administration basically they get the support from the tech bros and the finance bros. And both are deeply enmeshed in this AI bubble that's been built up. They're trying to sell to the public. And China remain is a huge threat because when people start asking questions. Okay, why do Sam Altman need $500 billion to build the Stargate project when China just trained DeepSeek for $5 million? There's a disconnect here. There's because China just make everything cheaper. Has been the case ever since China's industrialized. China has been making everything cheaper, and it's going to be true for AI as well. Now, this is why former Google CEO Eric Schmidt, he was one of those tech bros that was leading the crusade against China's AI development. And his solution under the Trump first term and then Biden administration was to start the chip sanction. That was Eric Schmidt's brainchild, the chip sanction, the semiconductor restriction. So what you saw, the latest restriction against Huawei, that's only the latest manifestation of the same AI chip sanction against China. So what they're saying right now is anybody in the world that's going to use Huawei's Ascend chip or Huawei Ascend chip train AI, that's going to be a violation of US export control laws. So what they're saying is if a Chinese company in China that's catering to Chinese consumers, if they use Huawei Ascend chips to train a Chinese AI, they will be violating United States export control laws that will make them liable to be placed on US entity lists and be placed on US sanctions. This is how crazy this sanction is. They're threatening to sanction everybody unless you have to get on the US AI that's powered by NVIDIA chips. It's made in US. And again, this all feeds into that AI bubble that I was talking about, right? I mean, their $500 billion investment on Stargate depend on this. This is how they're going to convince all the oil sheiks to come up with that money to invest in this bubble. So they have to forbade any alternatives. You know, China presents alternative. They don't want that. They say everybody, not just American companies, not just American citizens, but everybody across the globe, you must be using American AI on American chips. And that's what the new legislation is saying. I mean, this is crazy. I think what this is going to push China to do is to even deepen the kind of the bifurcation of the technology. Eric Schmidt himself talked about this before. He says there's going to be a bifurcation of internet, of AI. It will be a Chinese AI, it will be American AI. But I think what happened is for a lot of the global South countries, why do they have to pay lots of money to use OpenAI, to use American made OpenAI, right? When they can just use open source DeepSeek. DeepSeek is free. They can use DeepSeek. I think eventually what's going to happen is United States is going to build a technological wall around US, maybe all the Anglo Five Eye countries, and maybe some of its European allies. The so-called international community, right? Really US and its vassal states. And this is going to be like a Cold War 2.0. But instead of the US bloc and the Western bloc, the Soviet bloc, the position is going to be reversed because a lot of people don't realize this. Like, because of the fact that China is a manufacturing superpower, the power is really not in the trade deficit countries. The power lies with the producers, and including producer AI. And China is right now really pushing the frontier of AI right now. They're challenging the US lead, the US dominance in that space. And I have full confidence they will come out ahead. And then with this bifurcation of the world of the US AI, Chinese AI, whatever, the US bloc will occupy a similar position where the Soviet bloc was before during Cold War. It'll be a much, much smaller collection of countries, much smaller collection of economies, and eventually it will just atrophy and lose this Cold War 2.0. Prediction is always dangerous, but this is my prediction for the future. My crystal balls tell me this.
I mean, I think I was hearing too that Microsoft didn't they fire or they let go, they let go 3% of their workforce because of AI. That's what they're claiming. So it's just such a funny thing, like when we're looking at it, like you're saying, this idea that they're going to be competing with China, and then this idea of like, during this whole trade war, you heard Besson and everyone saying things like, "Oh, but America has the number one consumers. Everyone wants our consumers." But if you're like letting go of everyone, you're not looking after anyone. There's no social net. There's no how are they going to continue to be the world's number one consumers? It's just insane.
I mean, I think U.S. foreign policy for many decades right now is basically lighting fire around the world. So it makes the United States seem this oasis of calm. So people will park their money into U.S. Treasury bonds, U.S. stocks, U.S. real estate market. I mean, this is why Trump is going to the Gulf. He's trying to convince them to continue to put money in with the United States. And this is also why U.S. is starting proxy war all over the globe. But I think that eventually will come to an end because like now the global south is rising. The reason a lot of people are hoping BRICS can be a forum that can counter the Western hegemony because they're getting sick and tired of US dictating terms to the globe. So we are witnessing like imperial decline by imperial overreach at this point. Exactly how long it will take, who knows? But right now the trend is very clear. U.S. empire is on a secular decline.
I mean, that is the thing that is very scary about this moment is definitely we're seeing the decline, but we're also seeing an escalation of belligerence or however, actually, the recent military conflict over Kashmir between India and Pakistan. I mean, this could possibly be one of the shifts that you're talking about in terms of the military industrial complex. But a lot of the Western media outlets have been reporting this as the first battlefield test for Chinese manufactured weapons against Western arms. Obviously, this is an anti-war and anti-imperialist podcast. So this is kind of an interesting development, but it's also extremely alarming because it kind of suggests a possible, I mean, it definitely escalations in terms of a weapon, arms, and, you know, but what do you think this means? Like, what do you think this means for the US military industrial complex? And what does this mean for a pathway to peace?
Well, U.S. military industrial complex is in trouble because, as I mentioned earlier, the industry has been hollowed out so much. Now it's start to affecting the U.S. defense industries. When U.S. have to go to other countries to help to build warships to contain China because U.S. is not capable. Some people already call what happened during the India-Pakistan conflict kind of the deep seek moment, but for the Chinese weapon systems. Because for the longest time, there's still a lot of copium about China produced weapon. Like, they're made in China. They must be shoddy quality. And you have some crazy reporting about like how Chinese rockets are full of water, right? I mean, that's so ridiculous, but still people who buy it in the West. But now we've seen like a Chinese produced a weapon system, a Chinese built fighter jet J-10C, Chinese built air-to-air missile PL-15 went head to toe against Europe's most advanced fighter jet, Rafale, and shot down. We have a confirmed kill of Rafale jet. It's undeniable anymore. And the J-10C is not even the top of the line in the Chinese arsenal because People's Liberation Army Air Force already start to stop taking orders for additional J-10C because they are now expanding their inventory of the stealth fighter jet J-20, which is the fifth generation fighter. And China recently just flew two prototypes of sixth generation fighters. And that itself is quite shocking because for United States, the US sixth generation fighter is still on the PowerPoint presentation phase. You know, the so-called NGAD, the next generation air dominance, how United States call it. They're still trying to decide whether it's going to be manned or unmanned. China already flew their prototype. US sixth generation fighter still on the drawing board. And China will probably field their sixth generation fighters by 2030s, which, by the way, this is another reason I don't give too much stock to all the fear mongering in the English language media about China going to invade Taiwan in 2027. It's like, why? Like, why not wait 2030? Well, why? I mean, like every year China waits, the Chinese relative strength to United States is grow even more stronger. There's no point for China to push this confrontation right now. That's in fact the U.S. agenda. Pentagon has repeatedly its white papers through its think tank saying, "Oh, we have a limited window to contain China because beyond 2030s, you will be very difficult because Chinese economies be so much bigger and Chinese military will possess too much firepower for us to do anything about it." And they are the ones that trying to find a way to start a fight before that eventuality. For China, why don't they just wait 2030 until they field their sixth generation fighter and US still have none? So this is why I don't foresee an imminent war breakout over Taiwan, at least not initiated by China. But after this trade war, I don't think US is ready to initiate one either because I post this on Twitter. I say US neither have the balls nor the means to start a war with China right now. And I think it's clear from the self-imposed trade embargo. I mean, like Pentagon has been talking about for a long time about decoupling from China. One of the reasons they gave was, okay, if a war starts, we will have our hands tied behind our back because our economy is so entwined, we'll end up hurting ourselves. So the solution is to cut off the ties right now, right? Well, they just had a trial run. I mean, Trump just literally had a trial run right now, and it was pandemonium. Like I said, he hasn't really hit the U.S. consumer yet because they're still working off the 5 to 7 weeks of inventory that has been built up. So I don't think a direct war between U.S. and China is in the cards in the immediate future. it doesn't mean that US will not try to start proxy war, like how they try to use Ukraine as a proxy war against Russia. This is why we see US is stirring up tension in South China Sea again using Philippines, because Philippines right now is US linchpin, the linchpin in the US strategy to contain China in the Pacific region, because US claim they're, oh, we're trying to maintain an open and free Indo-Pacific, and this is why we gotta do freedom of navigation patrol in South China Seas, because it's such an important sea. US, they keep on, through their control media, they keep on saying, oh, South China Sea is such a vital to the international trade, $6 trillion worth of goods pass through there. They never tell you more than 80% of the trade through South China Sea is to and from China. So they're really saying the US Navy is in South China Sea to protect China's vital sea lanes from China itself. I mean, that's ridiculous. I mean, what they're really doing is saying, hey, look, we can threaten your vital sea lane in South China Sea. We know, where you get oil from Middle East, they have to go through South China Sea. See, we can make mischief for you. I mean, that's what they're really doing. But I still don't think there's going to be a major flare up of issues. Even things are changing in the Philippines itself. In the recent election, we saw the support for the former President Duterte's daughter is rising over the President Bongbong Marcos. And China is very wise in not to take the bait. I think that the possibility of a war breaking out in East Asia is rather low at this point, because both China and its neighbors have no interest to see a war breaking out, because they know if a war was fought, it will be fought in their neighborhood. It will be their trade lane that's getting disrupted. It will be their cities that will be affected. Their economy is going to be foobar. So I don't think war is in the cards in Southeast Asia, and China will continue to do what they always do, which is continue focus on their own internal development. And US at this point, it's doing a lot to self-sabotage its own position, as we've seen what the Trump has done. The US international reputation have been dragged through the mud. And it's going to take a long time to recover that trust. So, I over short term, intermediate term, I'm still very positive about the future.
Really? I mean, Trump did just announce that he wanted a $1 trillion defense budget. And by the way, like just for people who might not know, last year it was just under 900 billion, but that's the official numbers, but actual numbers are more like 1.4, 1.5 trillion. So if you're announcing a $1 trillion budget, does that mean a $2 trillion budget?
Pentagon never passed an audit.
Right.
Pentagon hasn't
They've had
passed an audit
seven.
for decades. And
Right.
and all these spending like they sent to Ukraine, that's not part of the official defense budget. They're sending a lot of weapons to Ukraine, and that's not part of the official defense budget. That's not part of the 900 billion.
Oh my
So,
God.
they're spending way, way more than that.
Yeah, that's crazy. So, good luck to us all. But I like that you've sort of ended us on a positive note. I was gonna say one other thing that hopefully will not derail us into something negative. But I've just been thinking about this. We had Victor Gao on, and he talked about the is it ICBM? You know what I mean? And he was like, those missiles can reach any corner of the world. To me, sounded like, I mean, obviously it's a warning to the US. It's just that can the US hear the warning or not? That's the question, I guess.
Sometimes you gotta put the fear of gods into those dumb numbskulls in the Congress. But I mean, like, people still talking like China or Russia will not have the capability to strike back. I mean, that's nonsense, right? I mean, in the age where China has hypersonic missiles and United States doesn't, the problem, Leanna, is that people in Washington, they have produced so much anti-China propaganda. It's permeated the Anglo media, and that they start to believe their own propaganda. Like all their information about China is come from all the same mainstream media channels that they themselves have polluted with disinformation. So this is why it leads to people like Scott Besson to come to very wrong conclusions about China. They think, oh, they need our money. China is going to collapse anytime soon without trading with United States. When in fact 19% of China's GDP is export, and out of the 19%, 14% is to the United States. So we're talking about 3% of China's GDP is to the United States. If China stopped trading with United States, it's gonna hurt. That 3% of GDP is gonna hurt. But you know what? That's not fatal. That's not existential. China can take the pain and move on. And China showed in this trade war that they're ready to do that. They're fully ready to carry on. It's the United States that keep on begging to have a talk. And so people in Washington at some point they need to wake up and see the reality because I think the Beltway bubble has blinded them to kind of the real geopolitics of the world. And like I would not say the Congress people are dumb people because they're actually very smart about lining their own pockets. But beyond that, they're not very good for anything. They're very good for grift, for corruption, for profiting at the expenses of American taxpayers. But other than that, I mean, you just listen to them talk because these guys are dumb. Sometimes you need people like Victor Gao to remind them how it is.
I mean, the one thing that when I was asking about the Kashmir situation and basically it's a question of China entering the military industrial complex well, I mean, I guess we can't really say it that way, but entering sort of the military industry in this capacity, do we have anything to worry about? Like, if China's not going to give any restrictions on weapons sales, might not be true anyway. They might not just be selling to anyone in any capacity. There seems to be some sort of centralized, there's centralized planning, there's generally a thoughtfulness to it. But yeah, break that down for me. Like, do I have fears
Well, I
in
mean,
my head?
U.S. is still by far the world's largest arms dealer, and a lot of the U.S. make use its own geopolitical heft to make sure that's the case. I mean, for example, you asked about Indonesia. Indonesia is buying F-15 from United States, and part of that is to be on U.S. good side. To be on the U.S. good side, you gotta grease the U.S. in the military industrial complex somewhat. And this is Taiwan's predicament too. I mean, Taiwan buy a lot of very expensive but ultimately useless military platform, weapon platform from the United States. And everyone in Taiwan understand this is not really for defense of Taiwan per se. This is more like to make U.S. Congress people happy. So they will continue to politically support Taiwan. I mean, this is a game. And this is why US is trying to push F-35 on all its allies. It's not that 35 is a great fighter, it's because this fattens the purse of the military industrial complex. And in fact, the F-35 is a very versatile plane, right? And it can sometimes double a submarine in the bottom of the ocean. But it's not designed to fight a war. It's designed to be the boondoggle that it is, to line in the pocket of all the defense contractors, all the lobbyists, all the top brass who get kickbacks so they can retire comfortably to the Bahamas. It's a big grift, and so is a $1 trillion official defense budget. And I think this is another reason I'm more optimistic about not probably not going to be a hot war happening between US and China because I trust in the sense of self-preservation of the Pentagon top brass. They still want to retire to Bahamas, after pocket their profits on F-35s. They're not suicidal.
Okay. All right. We will hope on the non-suicidal of the top brass in Congress. Thank you so much, Carl, for coming on Global Majority for Peace. It was an absolute pleasure. Do you have any last words?
Thank you for inviting me. I was actually surprised when you heard that. I was inspiration for you to start this podcast. I'm really honored. And thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for watching. See you next week.